The year was 1619, a year that would be remembered, though not by those who lived through it. On the shores of Jamestown, Virginia, the English colony sat on the edge of the vast and unclaimed wilderness, its settlers struggling to survive in a land both strange and hostile. Yet, one late summer day, the colonists' fortunes would change when a Dutch ship sailed into the bay, bringing with it an unexpected and troubling cargo. 17-year-old Thomas Haverley, newly arrived from England with dreams of adventure and prosperity, stood among the gathered colonists as the ship dropped anchor. The wind carried the scent of salt and wood, mingled with a faint, pungent odor Thomas couldn't place. The ship's crew lowered a gangplank, and as the captain barked orders, a line of shackled figures appeared. Men, women, and children, dark-skinned, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, were prodded onto the dock. Thomas felt a shiver of unease as he watched. They were unlike any people he had ever seen, their skin gleaming like polished wood under the sun, their faces filled with fear and exhaustion. The colonists whispered among themselves. These were no Englishmen, no indentured servants bound to labor for a mere 7 years. These were slaves, taken from the distant shores of Africa. Captain Godfrey, the ship's master, wasted no time in negotiating with the governor of the colony. He boasted of his journey across the Atlantic, of the African kingdoms from which these people were captured, traded like cattle for guns, cloth, and rum. The governor eyed the human cargo appraisingly, his mind already calculating the value of each pair of strong arms for the tobacco fields that stretched endlessly beyond the settlement. For Thomas, it was a moment of revelation. This was the new world, the land of opportunity, but it was also a place where human lives were treated like merchandise. It unsettled him deeply, though he was too young and powerless to voice his concerns. As the slaves were auctioned off to various settlers, Thomas met the gaze of a young woman, barely older than he was, who stood at the end of the line, shackled to an elderly man. Her dark eyes bore into his, not with pleading, but with an intensity that made him look away. He did not know her name, nor did he understand the horror of what she had endured, but in that moment, something within him shifted. The New World was not just a land of opportunity, it was a land of cruelty. The years passed, and slavery became entrenched in the southern colonies. By the 1700s, the Atlantic slave trade was booming. Ships like Captain Godfrey's sailed back and forth between Africa, the Caribbean, and the American colonies, carrying goods one way and human beings the other. Entire economies were built upon this brutal triangle of trade, where people were reduced to commodities. The slaves were captured in Africa, often by rival tribes or through European raids, and sold to traders who forced them aboard cramped, disease-ridden ships for the grueling Middle Passage. Some ships could carry hundreds of captives at a time, shackled together in chains, with barely enough room to sit up. They were fed little, and many died of starvation, disease, or despair before ever reaching land. In Charleston, South Carolina, one such ship, the Prosperous, docked on a humid summer morning in 1753. Among its cargo was a man named Kofi, a warrior from the Ashanti Kingdom, who had been betrayed by a neighboring tribe and sold to European traders. His journey across the ocean had been one of unspeakable suffering, but Kofi had survived, clinging to memories of his homeland and the hope of one day returning. But Charleston was not home. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and salt water, and the docks were crowded with traders, plantation owners, and onlookers eager to see the latest shipment of slaves. Kofi and the others were herded off the ship and onto an auction block, where they were prodded, examined, and sold to the highest bidder. Kofi was purchased by a wealthy planter named Edward Carlisle, who owned a vast rice plantation along the South Carolina coast. Carlisle took pride in his plantation, and though he spoke of Christian virtue and kindness, his treatment of his slaves was anything but merciful. Kofi, along with dozens of others, was sent to the rice fields, where the work was grueling, the conditions harsh, and the overseers brutal. The slaves labored from dawn until dusk, standing knee-deep in the flooded fields, their backs bent under the weight of baskets of rice. Punishments for disobedience were swift and severe, whippings, shacklings, or worse. But Kofi did not break. His body bore the scars of his new life, but his spirit remained unbroken. In the evenings, when the overseers were gone, he spoke to the others in his native tongue, telling stories of home, of freedom, and of the gods who watched over them. He refused to let them forget who they were. For generations, the lives of slaves in America were filled with hardship and suffering. Families were torn apart at auction blocks, mothers separated from children, husbands from wives. The work on plantations was backbreaking, whether it was in the tobacco fields of Virginia, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, or the cotton fields that came to dominate the South. On Carlisle's plantation, a young girl named Abney, born to one of the enslaved women, grew up in the shadow of the rice fields. She had never known freedom, and yet she yearned for it with every fiber of her being. Her mother had once told her stories of Africa, of the lush forests and the people who lived there, free and proud. Abney clung to those stories, even as the chains of slavery seemed to tighten around her with each passing year. Life on the plantation was a constant struggle. Abney witnessed countless horrors, beatings, rapes, and deaths. Yet the slaves found ways to resist. They sang songs in the fields, coded messages of hope and rebellion that the overseers could not understand. They held secret gatherings at night, where they prayed to both Christian and African deities, seeking deliverance from their oppressors. And sometimes, they ran. Abney heard whispers of the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and abolitionists who helped slaves escape to freedom in the North. It was a dangerous journey, fraught with the risk of capture and death, but for many, it was the only hope they had. By the mid-19th century, tensions between the North and South were reaching a boiling point. Abolitionists in the North, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, were speaking out against the evils of slavery, while Southern planters clung fiercely to the institution that had built their wealth. The nation was divided, and in 1861, it erupted into civil war. For Abney, the war was both a blessing and a curse. The chaos of the conflict brought the possibility of freedom closer than ever before, but it also brought violence and uncertainty. Plantation owners, desperate to hold on to their slaves, tightened their grip, fearing rebellion. But in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in the Confederate States were to be set free. It was a bold move, and though it did not immediately free all slaves, it marked a turning point in the war and in the fight against slavery. As Union soldiers marched through the South, they brought freedom with them. Abney, now a young woman, watched with disbelief as the Confederate soldiers retreated from the fields. One day, a Union officer arrived at the Carlisle plantation, his blue uniform a symbol of liberation. The slaves gathered around him, their faces etched with years of suffering, hope flickering in their eyes. "You are free," the officer said simply. Abney fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had dreamed of this moment her entire life, but now that it had come, it felt unreal. She looked around at her fellow slaves, her family, and saw the same mixture of disbelief and joy. For Kofi, now an old man, the moment was bittersweet. He had lost so much over the years, his homeland, his family, but in this moment, he felt a sense of peace. He would never return to Africa, but perhaps, in this new world, there was still a chance for a life lived freely. The end of the Civil War brought freedom to millions of slaves, but the path ahead was fraught with challenges. The Southern economy lay in ruins, and former slaves, now free men and women, faced a new struggle, the fight for equality. Reconstruction promised hope, but the rise of white supremacy, Jim Crow laws, and the Ku Klux Klan soon dashed many of those dreams. For Abney, freedom was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of a new one. She moved north, where she found work as a seamstress and raised a family of her own. But she never forgot the horrors of the past, nor the strength that had carried her through them. The story of slavery in America is one of unimaginable cruelty, but it is also one of resilience and survival. From the shores of Africa to the plantations of the South, the voices of the enslaved echoed through history, demanding to be heard. And though the chains of slavery were broken, the scars remain, a reminder of a time when human lives were bought and sold, their dignity stripped away in the name of profit. Years after the end of the Civil War, Abney sat in her small home in Philadelphia, watching her grandchildren play outside. The sound of their laughter filled the air, a sweet contrast to the painful silence that had once filled her life. The city had its own struggles with racism, but here, she could walk freely, earn her living, and see her children grow up unshackled. Kofi's legacy lived on in Abney's heart, his stories of Africa, and the strength of their ancestors. She had survived not only slavery but the brutal aftermath of Reconstruction, where white Southerners sought to reclaim the control they had lost. She had seen the birth of the Klan, the rise of segregation, and the constant attempts to remind Black Americans that freedom had come at a price. But Abney refused to be cowed. She joined the voices demanding justice, voting when the law finally allowed her to, attending rallies for equal rights, and raising her children to believe in a future where they could live as full citizens. Still, the wounds of slavery lingered across the South. Sharecropping and economic exploitation kept many former slaves in poverty. Racial violence was rampant. But the spirit of resistance was unbroken. From the fields to the cities, Black Americans continued to build their communities, educate their children, and carry forward the dream of true freedom. In 1865, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States, it had marked the official end of one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history. But true freedom, the freedom to live without fear, to claim one's full humanity, was still a distant goal. As Abney watched her grandchildren, she knew that the struggle was not over. But she also knew that the strength of her people, forged in the fires of slavery, would endure. They had survived the unimaginable, and they would continue to fight for a better tomorrow. The sun began to set, casting a golden light over the quiet street. Abney smiled softly, whispering to herself the words her mother once said, "We are the seeds that will rise again." And rise they would. From the ashes of slavery, a new generation was growing, one determined to build a world where the chains of the past would no longer bind them. Freedom had come, but the true story of America, the story of justice, equality, and human dignity, was still being written.